Okay, so up until this point, you have mastered the historical tool of continuity and change, and we've applied that when looking at what has changed, what has remained the same from colonial life to the young United States, and also looking at the 21st century America today, what has continued since the colonial era. Now we're going to, in this short lecture, we're going to look at another tool called causation. The causes and how cause and effect has its important elements to it that allows us to understand how things happen, why things happen, and perhaps the repercussions of certain things occurring. So looking again at the Revolutionary War, but now we're going to zoom the lens out and look at revolutions of this time period in general, the Atlantic revolutions. And applying also continuity, looking at their echoes. What effect do these Atlantic revolutions have on its direct society, on areas around them, and also perhaps looking at the same mentality, same sentiments of revolution, all the way up to, again, the 21st century today. So applying continuity and change, but really focusing on causation. So in this little short lecture, we're going to look at four things. We're going to look at ingredients for a revolution, specifically looking at political, ideological, economic, and social. And this is a bit of a review because we really expanded on this when we were looking at the American Revolution in general. But now, again, I want you to look at this as American Revolution in a global setting, in this Atlantic world. And how what's happening here didn't happen in a vacuum. All the effects that we see that happen on the individual lives in American colonies happen elsewhere as well. If we're looking at the exchange of good and people and ideas that came to and changed life in colonial life, that same effect happened everywhere else in that exchange as well. And so it has a very similar effect, and we're going to see how that plays out with each other. So it's kind of a global history lecture, but looking at it from the viewpoint and how it affects the young United States. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. Number two, we're going to look at a thing, and it will make sense when we get there, of two broken houses. And we're going to look at the U.S. versus French Revolution, and very briefly, a brief overview of how they are different. So number three, we're also going to look at the Haitian Revolution. Now, what are we doing looking at Haiti in a U.S. history class? Well, it's going to make sense. It's a very important thing of this time period, actually. And I think bringing in all the information of the revolutions and how they really play off each other, domino effect, is really important. And we're going to finish this class looking at the revolution ideals and its realities, and going back to continuity, how it has a lasting effect through the 21st century today. Now, as you do this lecture, as you go through it, keep in mind a few key words. The Enlightenment Ideals, Toussaint Louverture, and the Louisiana Purchase. These three things are not the only things, but I think they're going to be important key terms for you to help understand and put things together as we go through this mini lecture ahead. Okay, so let's get started then. If we're looking at Atlantic revolutions, and keep in mind what you've already learned with the American Revolution, but we're going to apply that to a bigger theme here, what's happening across the Atlantic world. And again, going back to three important parts, the strategies and ingredients of a revolution of this time: political, economic, and social. With political, this is also tied, and we're going to look at it a little deeper, with the Enlightenment ideals. New ideas leading to revolution in both the Americas, that's North and South America, the Caribbean, and in Europe. So that's going to be important. Economic, we're going to look at how industry and independence equals a lot of money. That's through fighting, through warfare, through trade, through commerce. As you get into the 19th century and you get into industrialization, that's going to be costly, and they're going to that's going to play a big role in the second half of our class, but it's a big role in this as well. And then lastly in this is social. As a result of these changes, of the economic and political changes and tensions, you're going to have new development of relations in classes and race and sexes. So you're going to have class conflict, you're going to have racial conflict, you're going to have gender things, all looking at, again, going to ideas of inequality and looking at ways for personal development, personal growth, and also societal change. So these three things are going to be the bedrock, really, of the revolutionary sentiment that really kicks off the American Revolution, Declaration of Independence, French Revolution, and revolutions thereafter. So you can kind of see it a little clearer here. Enlightenment ideas. Now, what are some of those Enlightenment ideas that we have looked at in the past? Think of those. Think of those in this class of what led to the Declaration of Independence, what led to the writing of the Constitution. And if you've taken philosophy or other political science classes, think about what Enlightenment ideas created the ideas for people to get around in coffee houses and meeting halls and taverns to discuss what would be the perfect government. And this being what the founding fathers used as the experiment of the new nation. And so with these Enlightenment ideals, individual liberty comes up. The idea of individual liberty, idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? All those things, individual liberties, and also a contract with the government. This is not a new idea. John Stuart Mills did it with the Leviathan, and a very different way you see in the 1700s and 1800s. Even today, there's still political ideas coming out of political contracts, government by consent of the people in this case. But other people wrote about, you have to give up all those things to give it to a monarch. And there's certain rules and regulations of a monarch. That's John Stuart Mills and the Leviathan. And there's other ones as well. But in this case, looking at government by consent of the people combined with individual liberty, all being part of Enlightenment ideas, becomes the catalyst for a series of political revolutions, becomes the spark, becomes the battle cry, right, into the American Revolution. You could think of how that plays out in the American Revolution, but also the French Revolution. We're going to see with the Haitian Revolution as well, and all other ones if you look at South America and the revolutions that happened across there, and even into the 20th century, but that's a whole nother class. So two in general, ones that we've looked at before, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jean Locke. On one side, Jean-Jacques Rousseau talks about humans willingly entering into government in order to preserve their freedom. So the contract and expectation is that they're giving up some liberties to the government to preserve their freedom. Think about that. Think about how in some cases with the Senate and House of Representatives, you give up some of your rights to vote for someone to act in your place, or some of what you expect from a president, what you expect from the leader, and having that preserve your freedom. So there's that sort of contract that Jean-Jacques Rousseau is talking about. Also, he talks about the collective power of all people to vote on laws and the political act of action to act directly. So your direct involvement in government. Now, this seems, yes, of course, that's what it's all about. But this was new. This was new in this time period, and the United States is one of many that picks this up in the revolution and the development of the country. So this is an important part on one side of that contract. John Locke also talking about a contract that government is accountable to the people, for the people, by the people, and the government is accountable to that. So there's also written into a contract by John Locke. And government chief's concern that he writes is life, health, liberty, and possessions. That's translated a little differently for the United States, but that's what he writes about, and that's what's picked up into that sentiment of the Enlightenment ideals. So economic changes, of course, this is a very key ingredient. We've already seen this play out with the French and Indian War and the effects of that having on the Revolutionary War. But let's look at that again and take it a step back further and remember that the colonies by the British was largely seen in economic terms, right? It was seen as the responsibility by England to protect the colonies, but at a price. This was costly. We're going to have to send troops over there. And also the idea that the people poured into the colony with economic freedom, laissez-faire. They were able to have low taxes, free trade. They were able to have all these liberties without extra taxes in their mind. But that changed after 1764. And you've already understood that in this class. And you can understand what happened after 1764. And we're going to explain it a little bit more if you don't know what I'm talking about. But enforced trade restraints tighter. If you could kind of think of the grasp of the government of England tightening its grip to make sure that the economic price wasn't too costly and in fact was making the money. As a colony, their idea was to make money for the state and therefore raised higher taxes and also really enforced trade. And remember the policies that we've talked about with the mercantilism of being able to, and the navigation acts, all those things really tightened after 1764. And why was that? Well, of course, the French and Indian War, that 7 Years' War. If we're looking in the terms of how we've been looking at it, with the French and Indian War playing out in North America, that was incredibly costly to the British. And their rationale was, look, we sent our troops to protect you guys, the colonists. That cost us an exorbitant amount of money. And so therefore, you're going to have to pay the price. Part of our contract is that we protect you, but at a price. And you are now paying that price with higher taxes, with stronger enforced navigation act. All your trade needs to come to Britain, even if you're trading in other parts of Europe, or even if you're trading in South America, the Caribbean, those ships better come to England first, then get taxed, and then sent on its way. That made sure income was coming in, and largely because of the debt from the French and Indian War. Remember, though, the French and Indian War was a small theater in the greater global 7 Years' War. Of course, it wasn't 7 years, but it was, in fact, pretty much global in the ways that it was played out in the French and Indian War here, throughout Europe with the fighting, in India, in the around the East Indies, if you will, with the Ceylon. If there was a fighting here that was incredibly strong, and in the Philippines over different spices largely. But the fighting played out even in South America. All this was a land grab, was colonial grab, was land for trade routes. And fighting from Europe that was happening between different conflicts happening there. So England was not the only one that felt the sting of the price of war. All these places were, and France in general, Spain and Portugal, Sweden and Europe, Sweden and Poland, all the places in Europe that had colonial outposts looked to them to tax heavily. It happened in the United States. That led to the American Revolution. It's going to happen in France, leading to the French Revolution, and in other places of its territory as well. So economics is huge. Combined economic strains with the Enlightenment ideals, and you've got a good bunch of kindling ready to ignite into a huge bonfire. And that's what happens when you have colonists drawing on Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, John Locke, saying, hey, the government has a certain contract they have to uphold, and we have certain personal values, and that is being attacked by the taxes, right? And you get ideas like no taxation without representation. They're not being represented in government, and they're having to pay taxes. That's a bad split. That's a big part of this ingredient. Now, also, the social aspect, one of the social elements that we've looked at is that, look, you have the rich elite, the founding fathers, those land-holding aristocrat families. Those are using complex Enlightenment ideas and theories. Those are the ones who are reading. Those are, if you're Benjamin Franklin, you're actually meeting. You're going to France to the salons and meeting these intellectual thinkers and being part of it. Same, Thomas Jefferson is in the same boat. All these people, Enlightenment theories is huge. The poor colonists, how can they show their frustration? How can they, they're feeling the pinch of the taxes. They're the ones feeling the disenfranchisement. How do they voice their opinion? They could write treaties, and some of them do. Some of them write in paper, some of them write tracts. But in general, they have to go at it a different route. And they go after the royal officials physically. They they gang up on them, they string them up, they push them out of town, or they kill them. They burn houses, they burn ships, they assault people. This is what happens when you get these movements, right? You get these movements that they feel disenfranchised, the laws aren't protecting them, they're feeling the economic strains, they're feeling, also remember with the intolerable acts where they're bringing soldiers into homes and there's cases of, misconduct by the soldiers. That's all creating tensions. That's creating a very physical movement as well. Now think of how that might have a continuity into the 21st century and these elements. They're feeling disenfranchised. They're having all these things. One side of it, you have people writing about it and trying to make political change on one side, and on the other side, you're just having them lash out and make a stand and a voice in a different way. So the main ideas of these ingredients of the American Revolution also play out in revolutions across the Atlantic world.